So our next speakers have been involved in another very significant issue, and I'm very pleased to see it's on the agenda here. Just before I introduce the speakers, on Monday I spent, I think it was about 5 hours, facilitating a workshop of faith leaders in our community on the issue of domestic violence, because it's too easy for groups to say, well, it doesn't happen in our patch, and yet the evidence is it does. And so we brought together faith leaders across the faiths in South Australia, and we tussled through for 5 hours what we could do, and this is just the first of 3 workshops that will take place. So I'm very pleased to see that on your agenda here this morning, you're dealing with that issue as well. And so I'd like to invite Chris Howie, Operations Manager, Executive Operations Support, and Lachlan Ophoff, Operations Manager, Rostering and Resourcing within the South Australian Ambulance Service, who will share their efforts in the obtaining by SAAS of White Ribbon Accreditation. In his current role, Chris's varied portfolio includes all SAAS staff, wellness and assistance programs, and Lachlan is responsible for the coordination and maintenance of statewide rosters and resource planning. He's also a registered critical care nurse. Please welcome Chris and Lachlan.
Good morning, all. I just want to start off by acknowledging that domestic violence is something that's likely to affect either directly or indirectly every one of us across our lives. So some of the content of the presentation may provoke an emotive response. I just want you all to be cognizant that there is support services out there, and that the White Ribbon website has a huge directory of services that are available to you. So let's start off by talking about the elephant in the room. This is how SA Ambulance started its journey on White Ribbon. The poster that you see is a poster that we put around to all of our stations and around our head office. It had no words, it was just a picture of an elephant. The idea was to leave that in the storeroom, in the kitchenettes, for a good couple of weeks, and then release the campaign with "Let's talk about the elephant in the room." I'd like to do a quick exercise with the audience. What I want you to do is I want you to stand up if you know an amazing woman, whether that is your mother, your wife, your daughter, your girlfriend, your best friend. If you have an amazing woman in your life, please stand up. That's good to see. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to get everyone from this gentleman in the white t-shirt at the front over to here to sit down. So what we have about a third of the room still standing. 1 in 3 Australian women are affected by domestic violence. That means that many women, just from in this room, will have domestic violence in their life at some point. Of those people standing, I want you to stay standing if that amazing woman you've got in your mind is in the workforce. Not one sat down. Domestic violence is a workplace issue, and that's why SA Ambulance started its journey towards White Ribbon Accreditation. Thank you, Macy. What I'm about to do is I'm going to hand over to Chris Howie, who was the implementation manager for White Ribbon with SA Ambulance, and he'll talk you through some of the challenges that we faced and the methods that we took.
Thanks, Lockie. So I think it's fair to say that that this was a government-mandated activity. All government agencies within SA were required to undertake this process. So it was something that we hadn't necessarily considered, but ultimately it was an incredible journey that we went through, and certainly something that we all learnt an awful lot from, and we certainly feel that our organisation is better for it. Seems to be a lot of challenges up here on this list, and I will talk to each of one of those directly. But I think it's very fair and it's only appropriate to turn around and say this wasn't necessarily an easy journey for a number of different reasons. Some of the facts that we actually uncovered and things that we stepped through were actually quite confronting, quite challenging. not just for us who are trying to put the program into play, but also for our workforce. Part of the thing that's really amazing is that our workforce demographic now is pretty well 50-50, male-female. Now, I'm not sure about other services, but certainly when I joined the service about 19 years ago, it was not even vaguely close to that. But the cohort has certainly changed significantly, which is why this is such a vitally important subject, as challenging it is to discuss and to review. I think if anybody's going to decide to undertake this journey, it's really important to be well prepared for it, because there's a lot that has to occur as a direct result of it. But we didn't necessarily have that information leading up, so we kind of learnt as we went, which was a challenge in its own right. But firstly, I'll talk about some budgets and resources. I guess the first inkling we really got about how much work was going to be involved in this process was when we started reviewing a criteria document that's probably the better part of 80 to 100 pages long. And there are a series of criteria, all told probably around about 100, that you have to provide some very specific evidence of how you address those criteria. So it's only when we really started looking through those that we realised that we had quite a journey ahead of us. I think it's pretty fair to say we weren't really prepared for what we were going to have to do. And I guess this was confirmed when we actually had some conversations with South Australia Police, who'd been through the journey before us, who advised us that they actually ultimately put a full-time employee, a senior sergeant, in place for a 12-month window just to do all of the work that came with this activity. Aside from this, we would suggest that you probably need also an administration staff member, at least 50% of their time dedicated just to compiling all the evidence to bring it all together. So it's quite a significant thing. In terms of budget, we probably spent between $5,000 to $10,000, and we did things fairly conservatively, and on promoting, on events, on things that we were trying to bring together to actually raise the awareness about the circumstances. Probably one of the most important things in terms of your resourcing, though, is identifying a series of champions within the workplace. People who really have a drive and a passion for this, and who are going to support you get through the journey, because it cannot be a one or two person activity. It's significantly more than that. One of the questions that came up was, why just women? Violence is a very significant issue in ambulance services, and we're all aware of that, reflected by the fact that last year we won an award for education about violence in the workplace, and again, AB did this last night, same thing. So why is it just about women? The statistics are unfortunately very, very clear. On average, more than one woman a week is actually killed by a partner in some form of domestic relationship across Australia. Same-sex, LGBTI, violence against men being perpetrated by women is a much smaller number. So that is why White Ribbon in its own right is focusing on where the most need is in the short term. I must admit I actually had a personally very emotive discussion with a male staff member who was the victim of domestic violence being perpetrated by an alcoholic wife, and he'd spent 5 years protecting himself and his children. And so it was quite an interesting discussion to step through the process of understanding why we were doing what we were doing. A collective decision was made, though, that whilst we would be pushing the line of White Ribbon, which is the issue of domestic violence and violence being perpetrated by men against women, all of our communications were going to actually reflect the fact that SAS had a zero tolerance policy for any level of violence being perpetrated against any of our staff, irrespective of gender. Perception of White Ribbon. This was quite an interesting one, and one perhaps I hadn't necessarily considered myself until we started this journey. We see some quite challenging and interesting queries from some of our own staff asking why we're aligning ourselves so heavily with an organisation that raises funds to continue the work of awareness about the issue, but doesn't contribute any money towards services to support women who've been affected by domestic violence. Somebody said, why are we seeing all these millions of dollars going to this organisation but not being used for frontline services where it's probably most needed? And I guess in that regard, some staff elected to remain conscientious objectors, for want of a better term, in this space. I guess from our perspective, it made us stop and realise that the work the White Ribbon does is imperative. It's very important, and it's so well known around the world. But it's also important for us to create engagement with other agencies that might be providing a more hands-on service. And as such, we engaged with the Zara Foundation, and we also engaged with the Women's Safety Services SA area, who we continue to have a relationship with, who do provide services specifically for women affected by domestic violence. Conflicting priorities. We're all busy. Everybody's got workplace pressures, everybody's got exploding workloads, organisational pressures and expectations. And it's fair to say that we really did have a lot of time where we struggled to juggle the requirements of White Ribbon against what we have to do in our day-to-day business. So it's something you need to be mindful of if you're going to commence the journey, that you need to make sure that there's time and resources appropriately allocated for this. Jumping through hoops, I think it would be fair to say, if you hadn't picked it up, we had to do some things that were probably considered to be just jumping through the hoops, just for the purpose of the accreditation. Now, I don't say that lightly, and they were very small things that we had to do, and it might have been just a tweaking of some wording in a policy or something similar. Whilst we understood the intent, it was very specific what we had to address, but we had to do a certain amount of those activities. One of the challenges was you're required to do an entry and an exit survey, where you need to get 30% of your workforce to complete the survey, so you can get a base understanding of the views about domestic violence and a final view after the White Ribbon program has been run through the organisation, which takes about 18 months. This was a challenge for us. We've got about 80 work sites, and so it's not necessarily easy to get everybody to sit in front of a survey, in front of a computer, albeit for only 5 minutes or so, to undertake this activity. One of the poster agencies in our cohort was the EPA, who have a total of 200 staff, and they got 78% of their people did their entry survey, which was quite well received. We did point out, though, that all of their staff sit in front of a computer in the one building. So it's pretty easy to get everybody to go around and fill out a survey when you've got somebody standing over your shoulder saying this is a requirement, you will do this. It was much more challenging for us, but we did get our 30%, which is really important. But when these things started spread across the entire state, it's a bit like herding cats. White ribbon fatigue, this is probably one of the big ones. It was a long journey. It was an 18-month window, and the expectation is there's a lot of discussion, a lot of publicity, a lot of promotion of the cause, and a lot of messaging needed to be constantly reviewed, both in social media, etc., and to staff communication directly. We did get to a point in the end where the staff had become a little bit cynical, and they were sort of saying, okay, we get it, we've got the message, when's this going to stop? When's enough's enough? And I think it's interesting to note that we really struggled to get our 30% towards the end. We only got about 32% for the exit survey, which was much less than what we got going in, and it was a lot harder work to do it. Being prepared to walk the road alone, I guess that is, White Ribbon will very much make a point that this is an individual organisation's journey. So whilst they provide a level of support, you as an organisation need to look at your own circumstances, your own policies and procedures, and see where it is that you need to make changes in your workplace in order to address the specific criteria. I guess the other challenges too, and Georgie touched on this, was we need to ensure that our staff, irrespective of their gender from our perspective, felt supported enough to be able to feel as if they could disclose, either to a manager or through our employee assistance program, if there were victims of this sort of activity, and or if they just wanted to access some of the services that we highlighted were available for them. So they needed to feel that you know, they weren't going to be a victim a second time around. I think that's a really important point. That they could understand they were going to be supported in their process, and that we were there to support them any way we could. So the staff scepticism, again, we did cover that on some previous points, but you know, you're going to get a mix of people who are both happy but not necessarily happy about why we're doing it and the real true reasons behind it. So some of our methods. We collaborated with other health networks within SA Health, and this was really good in a whole lot of ways. This, in fact, enhanced a lot of relationships and networks that were already existing. But we did this with all of the other major hospitals and health networks. So Southern and Central and Country, Women's and Children's Health Network and Northern also were involved. So we had key representatives from all those agencies working together to make sure that we were able to actually address all the criteria, but also share information, share knowledge, share work that had already been done, instead of having to try and reinvent the wheel every single time. You need to be a little bit tenacious and determined. You've got to, as I said, identify your champions, those that are going to help you actually get to where it is you want to get to in the end. And you needed a small and focused group to be able to achieve this. As I say, as Lockie mentioned, I was the implementation manager. We had a senior male executive member, Koo, who was the executive sponsor. And then we had a small project team who really probably did, to be quite honest, the fair share of the heavy lifting as part of the process. As I mentioned earlier, you've got to map the criteria, and the criteria is a big document. So Lockie spent quite a bit of time pulling it apart, putting a project timeline against it, and then we allocated certain areas to go to certain people to make sure that we were addressing all the criteria as we needed to. So really important that you have that committed small group to manage. It just gets too big sometimes if you have a big committee, but this was a very small and focused group, and some of those members are here today, and I thank you for all your work in that space. Had to be a little bit innovative and lean in your thinking. As Lockie mentioned, we just put the poster up of the elephant, and it really did start an awful lot of conversation. Nobody knew what it was about. There was all these different assumptions, and I think there were a few, quick thinking ambos had a few books running on exactly what it meant, and some people might have made a bit of money out of it, I suspect. But it just started a whole lot of conversation. It got people thinking, and it was doing something different, and I think that was what was important, and we tried to continue that sort of theme throughout the process, and Lockie will talk about some of those things coming up. Lean thinking, when we're talking about that, we're just saying we don't have a lot of resources, we don't have a lot of money, but we've still got to achieve an outcome. And so we had to make sure that what we were doing was manageable, it was transportable, and again, South Australia is a big map, a big state, and as we saw on the map, there's a lot of space to cover, and we've got 80 odd stations that we need to be able to communicate information out. So we had to make sure that every station, whether it be the smallest station in the country to the largest metropolitan station, had access to the same information and was receiving the same level of communication about what we were trying to achieve. Leveraging off other groups was really important. As I mentioned before, if we'd known in advance of the activity some of the things that we knew now, or know now, we would certainly have probably approached some things differently and committed different resourcing to it, etc. So it was really important to leverage off other cohorts or other groups that have been there and done it before. So we did that with the police and we did that with the Department of Health, but we also leveraged off the other groups in our cohort. So the Metro Fire Service were doing that with us, and so we worked very closely with them, and we had some shared joint functions and things with them so that we weren't having to do the same thing in isolation. Communications and consistent messaging with staff are really, really important. And again, part of that was all about the process of ensuring that the white room fatigue didn't take over, and that we actually had information about what we were trying to do and why we were doing it, being circulated out through the staff as regularly as possible. I think the other thing was making sure that it was a consistent message too, so that everything we were putting out was the same message for everybody, and it was one source of truth, I guess, coming through the process to make sure that everybody understood this is something that our organisation very much felt strongly about, and it was an effort that was going to be a collective one. It wasn't just about the small group of people. Everybody as an agency needed to pull together to get us across the line in this space. So I'll just hand back to Lockie to talk about some of the benefits and successes.
So whilst there were lots of challenges, there was a bit of fun along the way and a lot of learning, and there was definitely benefits and successes to the organisation. Relationships with other agencies. We met some incredible, inspiring people along the way and heard some horrific stories. There was one in particular that I'll always remember, known as the 10-cent man, who he was totally banned from seeing his wife in any way, so the only way that he could get to her would be to donate, EFT 10 cents to her account to write abuse in the description. So the stories will stay with us forever. Increased understanding, decreased scepticism over time, and having support available for victims. I think it's really important that as managers did training, there were actually disclosures from within our own organisation that we had to deal with, and we were actually able to support them because we'd learnt stuff throughout the process. Relationships with other cohort members, as Chris mentioned, across other emergency services and the other local health networks within South Australia. Positive reinforcement from staff when we already had a fairly strong culture. So this was the day that we had with the MFS, which was right near the beginning, and it was the signing of commitment to undertaking the White Ribbon program. We had swear boards where people could sign up to take the oath saying that they will stand up and speak out. We established a site on our intranet page where we actually pulled across all the policies and procedures for the organisation into a one-stop shop for our staff if they needed it. I don't know what other organisations are like, but our policies and procedures can be difficult at times to find. We also involved the White Ribbon philosophy in our enterprise agreement, and that we were able to bring in things like special leave conditions and contributions that women were able to access if they were involved in domestic violence. We had an e-learning package that had to be completed by staff. There was 3 modules. All operational staff only were required to complete Module 1, and managers had to complete Module 2 and 3 as well. However, we noticed through the statistics that some of the staff actually elected to do Modules 2 and 3, which was fantastic to see. We also worked with the Working Women's Centre and the Central Domestic Violence Service in providing training to managers. Got to have barbecues, that's always good. And part of this was about creating awareness through sharing of food and also raising funds towards White Ribbon. And talking about innovation and a bit of creativity to get it all done, the aprons that you'll see our CEO kindly wearing, I actually got my little German grandmother to sew on the little white ribbons. So we went to all sorts of efforts we could to be frugal with money. We held a White Ribbon Ball in conjunction with the Young Professionals group of SA Ambulance, and that raised heaps of awareness, and it was actually just a really fun night, and we were able to get some really good messaging across in a non-confrontational, really work-structured way, so people were quite receptive to that. We got a little bit techo, and we had geo-filters at the White Ribbon Ball. So for those that aren't on Snapchat, it's where you can put in a little border around your photo based on where you're located for the night. And we had 2,122 views just from that. We held a self-defence class in Eastwood for operational stuff, and this was towards the end of our journey, and that was for all women employees that could go along to that. But we had some really good patient outcomes as well. So one of the things that was implemented was a sticker that goes along the back in the ambulance where the patient sits and they can see the sticker. And this was a twofold thing. It was to promote that we don't accept any form of violence within our service, but it was also a communication thing. Domestic violence, the perpetrator quite often is a controlling person, and so if that woman needed to go to hospital and the perpetrator was sitting in the front also going to the hospital, you could almost have a bit of a conversation without using words. So that was probably one of the best things that came out of the whole program for us. We also provided our staff with domestic violence safety cards. It's always a difficult subject and the timing might not be always right, and I guess in the ambulance world where you are with that victim for so long, you don't want to get them to divulge absolutely everything and then go, oh, we're at the hospital, see you later. So it's about opening that gateway of communication, providing them with some information or some services, because not all women will necessarily get out of the relationship the first time. It takes several times before they will leave a relationship. So at least we can provide them some information, and it provides a bit of structure for our staff to have a meaningful conversation with that patient. And if the journey is short, hopefully for them to be able to seek help, and also then we would hand over that sort of information to the emergency department staff as well. Once again, when we were wrapping up, we had to create some pictures, some graphics to put on our communication. with a huge budget, and that I got a little bit creative on paint and made some pictures and using our own staff as well, which was really important so that the operational staff could associate with the pictures that they were seeing, that domestic violence might not just be something that happens to our patients, but it actually happens to our staff within our own workplace. Probably the best thing is we got accreditation at the end, so that's always a nice end to it all. And one of the other things that we did is we also made a video, which I'll end on shortly. So the recommendations from our journey that I would part on to any other ambulance service looking at creating or going through the white ribbon journey is going with your eyes open. I know that the police force said to us that they had a full-time staff member on it, and it wasn't until we were already a fair way into the process that that really hit home for us, and we were already too far into it to then be able to source that FTE. Start work on it early, identify your champions throughout the organisation, map the criteria. This was hugely beneficial. So we created a whole heap of subfolders, and so as evidence was being collated throughout the process, we were able to automatically put them into the folder so that when you had to submit your portfolio of evidence, the structure was already there. Delegate tasks and criteria to work group members and then follow up with them regularly. Network with organisations that you probably wouldn't have ever encountered with, network locally, network within your own organisation, and for us within SA Health. And I think the biggest message is just because you get accreditation doesn't mean it's all over. Your accreditation only lasts for 3 years. You need to be showing ongoing support for your staff, ongoing effort into maintaining the message of domestic violence. It's not over just because you've got accreditation. So I'd like to end on a video. Once again, this was done with a huge budget of $0. It was filmed on an iPhone, and we used our own staff, we used our own homes, our own work site to do it, and then we played with some software to overlay some music. So the quality might not be there, but I think the message is loud and clear.
I swear to stand up and speak out and act to prevent men's violence against women.